27 is where we're going to start out today. Numbers chapter 27. So we're wrapping up Moses here, and as we wrap up Moses, big thing I want to talk about is passing the torch. When you talk about passing the torch, you're typically talking about giving the care of something you love to a younger person, right? So think about this. You could pass the torch on lots of different areas, but like if you were, say, a motorcycle enthusiast, you could pass that torch to someone else, right? Or if you were a pie maker, you could teach that to someone and pass the torch of making pies for the family. You could pass the torch as a sports fan for a particular team or a particular sport and get somebody else on that bandwagon. You could pass the torch in a profession, right? As a farmer or a teacher or a lawyer or whatever, an electrician. You could pass that torch to someone else. You can also pass the torch when it comes to faith, right? So I want to start off by asking you these two questions. What kind of torch are you passing? And to whom are you passing your torch? I think that a lot of times we pass torches that aren't really that important when it comes right down to it. And that torch of faith is really, really critical. So as Moses nears the end of his life, this becomes a very important question for him. He is passing on a torch of faith, but he's also passing on a torch of leadership for the nation of Israel. And remember, in Moses' early life, he tried to do God's work his way. It didn't work out well, right? It resulted in him going from living in the Pharaoh's home to living in the wilderness and tending sheep there for 40 years. It was not pretty. But as Moses began to surrender everything to God, it's amazing how God redeems even those 40 years that might seem like a waste in our lives. God is able to use those and leverage those lessons for something far greater, and he does that with Moses. Right? That 40 years in the wilderness with sheep becomes training ground for 40 years in the wilderness with the Israelite people. And God redeems it all. There were huge miracles that took place in that process, right? I mean, not just the plagues on Egypt, but even as the Exodus occurs and Moses is, instructed on how God's going to part the Red Sea with him. And then there's little miracles that happen along the way as well, that things we didn't hit on that are no less significant or meaningful. One of the ones I noticed as I was reading through this passage again, and passages around this, is that in the wilderness for 40 years, the Israelites' people's shoes and clothing never wore out. Now, I've got a few 20-year-old shirts in my closet. They're not pretty looking anymore, right? I might even have a couple almost 30-year-old shirts. I wish I could get a pair of shoes to last more than a year, let alone 40 years. And so, like, these are big things that God shows up. It's not a perfect scenario for the Israelite people or for Moses, but God is showing up. And there's some big highs with big miracles, and there's little miracles, and there's some incredible moments of worship, like when God occupies the tabernacle with his presence. And then there's likewise huge blunders into idolatry when they make a golden calf, and there's messes all along the way. As we discovered last week, even Moses had a big lapse of judgment, right? Where he struck the rock to produce water for the Israelite people, even though God's instruction to him was just to speak to it. But Moses was angry with the people, and he let his flesh get the better of him one more time. And this might seem like an insignificant error to us, but God saw it very significant. And it was what caused God to say to Moses, "You're not going to be able to go into the promised land either." That's tough, right? I mean, you got Moses at 120 years old. His eyes are still bright. He's still vigorous. But God is now saying, this is the end. This is the end of the road for you. You're going to get to see the promised land at a distance, but not go in it. And yet Moses doesn't throw a fit about this, which is truly remarkable. Things have certainly changed for him. Instead, he begins to go, okay, what's next, God? So let's take a look and note how Moses addresses this goal of passing the torch. We're in Numbers chapter 27, verse 15. And the first thing that happens is Moses seeks God's direction. Boy, that's a better start right out of the gate, right? Just like there's lots of things he could have done, but thank God he starts by seeking God's direction. In Numbers 27, verse 15. Then Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "May the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who will go out and come in before them and who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep who have no shepherd." So he's coming to God saying, God, please show me what's next for these people. Provide someone for them. And this has not always been the way Moses addressed things or approached things. In the past, Moses took things into his own hand, but not this time. In the past, Moses made it about himself, but not this time. If Moses had still been in that place, maybe he would have been thinking differently about this passing of the torch. Maybe he would have been, lining up his own sons for this kind of role. If Moses had not learned how to follow God, he may have led very differently, but he refused to move forward without an indication from God on what was next. And I would just ask you, are you learning that lesson? Are you learning that before you take the next step that you should stop and go, God, what is the next step you have for me? What is the direction of my life supposed to be? And not just charge ahead and do whatever seems right to us. Sometimes when we do that, we end up in a big pickle. Do you really seek God for direction? It's interesting because it may or may not be who you think it would be that God would provide here. We probably know, you probably have read these scriptures, and you know where this is going. But in this case, God's selection seems like the really obvious choice. Like almost Moses wouldn't have even had to pray. He could have just been like, okay, who should I pick? Yeah, duh. It should be Joshua. Joshua has a really great resume with Moses. Joshua was one of the 12 spies that went into Canaan originally and came out, and there was 10 of them that gave a report that this is too crazy of a land and we're going to get swallowed up by these giant people. We're never going to make it. We're never going to be able to go in there. And Joshua and Caleb were the two that said, yeah, it might be terrifying, but if God sends us in, God will be victorious, and we should go. Right? So that's pretty good right there, right out of the gate. And because the Israelite people don't go, that's what makes them have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But Joshua stays really close to Moses. Joshua becomes basically Moses' right-hand guy. When Moses goes up the mountain, Joshua goes as far up with him as God will allow. When Moses comes back down the mountain and goes to his tent, Joshua goes to his tent. Joshua wants to be around Moses. He sees how God's using him. And so Joshua becomes basically the attendant of Moses. And whenever Moses would speak with God, Joshua's right there. And Joshua is the perfect choice. It's amazing that Moses doesn't just assume that. It's amazing that he still seeks God. So Moses is seeking God, he's praying, and God does point to Joshua. And as soon as Moses gets the green light, he begins preparing and equipping Joshua. So this is what happens in verse 18. Moses equips Joshua. So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him, and have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and commission him in their sight. You shall put some of your authority on him in order that all the congregation of all the sons of Israel may obey him. Moreover, he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by judgment of the Urim before the Lord. At his command they shall go out, and at his command they shall come in, both he and the sons of Israel with him, even all the congregation." So Moses is not putting Joshua in charge of just a portion of Israel or saying, hey, you get to be the the lackey here for a bit. He's really handing over the reins. And Moses has already been working closely with Joshua, but now Joshua is commissioned in front of those people. Joshua is given authority to lead, and he's given a priest. Kind of like Moses had Aaron, right? Joshua is given Eleazar. This is like the tandem here that are going to lead the people. Joshua as the commander and the leader in charge, but Eleazar as the priest that helps him discern God's direction. And and this is a pretty amazing tandem. So it goes down just like it said it should. In verse 22, Moses did just as the Lord commanded him. That's a good sign again. And he took Joshua and set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation. And then he laid his hands on him and he commissioned him, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. What I find amazing here is that Moses doesn't hamstring Joshua at all, right? Because sometimes when we pass the torch of leadership over something to someone else, we sometimes secretly hope that they're not as good at it as we were, right? We want them to struggle to fill our shoes just a little. Or we want people to go, well, they're not bad, but they're nothing like so-and-so was, right? And so you don't see any of that from Moses at all. Moses wants Joshua to succeed. Moses seems to understand that God's purposes are far more important than what people might think of him. So he's all in with Joshua. Before the installation of Joshua and the eventual death of Moses, if you flip over to Deuteronomy 29, we see some other things happening. And it's a little tricky to weave this all together because the book of Deuteronomy and Exodus and Numbers kind of overlap themselves in certain areas. And so what's happening before Moses steps aside is he's told by God to remind the people of all of the covenants that he's made with them and his faithfulness. So Moses in Deuteronomy 29 and 30 delivers Israel this clear reminder of the covenant that they've made, to obey God and how God will be faithful even when they're not faithful. Amen? Yeah. Even when they have rejected God's way and embraced hardship instead, God will always be orchestrating a way back for them. That's an amazing thing. And when they remember God and obey him, he will restore them over and over. In the end, like literally end times, which Deuteronomy does reference here, God will bring his people from the farthest places of the earth back to the land he gave them. He's not done. He doesn't give up. And if they choose him by faith, he will enable them to love him and to walk according to his ways. If they disregard his ways, they will easily be drawn into idolatry, which always leads to two things: captivity and then death. That's where idolatry leads, not just for the Israelites, for us as well. Right? When we start worshiping something other than God, that's idolatry. It leads us into bondage, right? Sin cycles that we struggle to break free from. And then eventually that captivity that sin takes hold of us leads to death. Romans says the wages of sin is death. So Moses lays out all of this warning, and he's telling the people, please choose God's way. And he's trying to set them up to succeed under Joshua. And just as Moses was to pass that torch of leadership to Joshua, he's encouraging these people of Israel to embrace the same idea, to pass the torch of faith and obedience to their next generations. Before all of this unfolds, Moses is informed that the people are not going to do well. He knows that they will play the harlot as they go into this land and are established in good ways. They're still going to fall way off track. And so historically, we see they haven't done well. Future-wise, Moses already knows they're not going to do well. It's not going to get better. And so as Moses is laying all of this out, I think it's fascinating to realize that Moses is truthful with Joshua about the struggles. Hey, we're setting you up. I'm equipping you. This is not going to be a piece of cake. It's not going to go smooth, right? Which is really good that Moses is honest with him. And Joshua hears Moses tell the people that they have this choice to follow God or not follow God. Deuteronomy chapter 30 is where we are right now. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, Moses says this to the people. He says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. You get to pick. Are you going to follow God or not follow God? And he says, so choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. So Moses helps people see that they're choosing. And sometimes I think we can get a little too rosy about Christianity, where we are like, hey, just jump in, it's awesome, and not really talk about the hard, right? Which is interesting because Jesus talked quite a bit about the hard of following him. He was very upfront when he said, you need to count the cost, because if you follow me, you will be reviled and hated. Boy, what a lovely invitation Jesus offers, right? And then he says things like, take up your cross and follow me. In other words, I want you to embrace death like I've embraced death. Not that you necessarily will die. In fact, you will live. But I want you to totally surrender your living to me. That's what it means to take up our cross. Say, Lord, my life is in your hands. The number of my days, you know them. I give it all to you. And to let go. When we totally trust Jesus with our life, with our days, with our death, then we really become unshakable. As long as we resist him and we fight for our way and our will, we will deal with slavery and death. But Moses is truly surrendered. As you roll into Deuteronomy 31, verse 1, it says that Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel, and he said to them, this is where he models this surrender. He said to them, I am 120 years old today. Happy birthday, Moses. I'm no longer able to come and go, and the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. This is no pity party. This is just statement of fact. God has said no. And even though Moses is installing Joshua and saying to people, hey, you're going to start to follow Joshua, Moses does something really great with this transition. He keeps the focus on God. Listen to how he sets this up in verse 3. Moses doesn't oversell Joshua as like, hey, Joshua will fix all your problems and you'll have no more issues. He says, it is the Lord your God who will cross ahead of you into the promised land. He will destroy these nations before you, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua is the one who will cross ahead of you, just as the Lord has spoken. The Lord will do to them just as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and to their land, when he destroyed them. The Lord will deliver them up before you. You shall do to them according to all the commandments which I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble at them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. God's plan never depends on just one person, unless that person is Jesus, right? But Joshua is not Jesus. Joshua is just the man that God has chosen. But God's saying, it's really me. At the heart of all of this, it's me. And Moses is making that very clear. This is God that's going to be at work. He would destroy. He would wipe these people out. It would not be Joshua. And keep in mind that some of these opponents were fear-inducing, right? You had giants in this land, literal giants. You had cities that were fortified like no one had ever seen before in Jericho. But with God being faithful, they're going to be okay. And so the next thing that Moses does is he challenges Joshua to be all in as he passes the torch to him. Don't hold anything back. Verse 7, then Moses called to Joshua, and he said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall give it to them as an inheritance. The Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. What a charge. You know, when it comes to leading others in faith, what are you afraid of? Because that's really what Joshua is being charged with here, is lead these people in faith. And he's being told, do not be fearful or dismayed. And I got to think that we sometimes are fearful and dismayed when it comes to faith things, right? Are you afraid if you try to lead in faith arenas or in faith topics? Are you afraid you won't be taken seriously? Are you afraid someone might ridicule you? Are you afraid they're going to poke holes in something you're saying? What are you afraid of? I ask that because I get afraid. And that might sound funny because I stand up and preach a sermon all the time, or, I go out and talk to people out in the community, and I don't look afraid, probably. But here's where I get afraid. Sometimes I get afraid with my family, more so than just anyone else. And I'll give you an example of that. So we got together this year on Thanksgiving, and with my extended family, like my siblings and my mom and my grandma, and it was good. And as we were getting ready to go, I thought, Dad's not here anymore, and I should probably mention to Mom that we should do some kind of devotion. That's something Dad would have done. So I mentioned that to Mom, and she goes, great, you do it. It's like, yay. And so I said, okay. And I started working on something. And as I was working on it, I had kind of flashbacks. And I remembered, it was probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago now, where I was trying to discuss something important that was on my heart with my siblings. And as I tried to go, hey, guys, I really want to talk about something important to me, my sister said, everybody be quiet, the pastor wants to say something. And I was like, oh. It really hurt my feelings, to be truthful. And as I was trying to work on this devotion, I kept hearing that. And so when it came to the Thanksgiving thing, and Mom had said, hey, this is when you could do a devotion, I was like, okay. But then we got to that point in our day, and she didn't say anything, and I was just like, it's all right. I don't have to do anything. And as I think back on this, and I kind of made excuses in my own head, I didn't really have anything that great to say anyway. I realized it really was just fear. It was not wanting any kind of jab or ridicule that made me go, I don't need to do this time. And I kind of took a step back. And I didn't bring it up again. And what's crazy is I have everybody in my family, my siblings, they're all Christians. So this is not like I'm up against the secularists and the heathens and the, whatever. It's not like that. We should all be on the same page. And yet we can, I still got fearful and not courageous. And I think about, even in our own home, I can't tell you how many times that we have tried to like set up family devotions, and you get everybody sat down, and especially as younger kids, it feels like they always got the giggles, and it just starts to make you mad. You're like, okay, I'm reading from the Bible, and everyone's snickering. I'm just like, either you go to your room or I'm going to mine. I don't know. I'm done. Just get frustrated, and then you give up. So I think I needed to hear, be strong and courageous. And maybe you need to hear, be strong and courageous. You don't have to be perfect, but we do need to be obedient, right? And we do need to step out and pass the torch. The reality is, it's not really about you anyway, right? It's about God. It's about what He's doing. And maybe you get to be a part if we're strong and courageous. The last thing that Moses does with Joshua to pass the torch is he establishes routines that point to God. Before he passes, if you look at verse 9, I'm just going to kind of summarize this, but essentially he gives them the law, and he says, this is when I want you to read the law to the people. And it's at the Feast of Booths every 7 years, gather everyone together, and I want you to read the law. And when Moses says you're going to read the law, what he's saying is you're going to read the book of Deuteronomy out loud to the nation. Okay. Now, maybe some of you have read the book of Deuteronomy. Yeah. How many of you have read it in one sitting? Yeah. How many of you read it in one sitting with a whole group of people standing around? Probably none, right? That's a really interesting thing to do. But Moses initiates this with God's direction, and he says in verse 12, assemble the people, the men, the women, the children, and alien who is in your town, so that they may hear and learn and fear the Lord your God, and be careful to observe all the words of the law. Their children who have not known will hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land which you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. So Moses instructed Joshua and the priest to build in routines that would be constant reminders of God's faithfulness. Crazy cool thing. The next thing, if you were to just glance ahead a few chapters to Deuteronomy 32, you see a song of Moses. And Moses writes this song that he's teaching to the Israelite people, to the whole nation. They learn to sing it because it's a song all about God's faithfulness. And he wants them to remember this song when they go off into idolatry and their whole life falls apart again, and they end up in exile. He wants them to remember this song, because maybe it will turn them back to him. So he's building these patterns and these routines. The intent was that when they strayed, these things would bring them back to remind them of their need for humble dependence on God. And I think we need that too. We need patterns and habits in our lives that remind us of God's faithfulness, that build in kind of a way in which we pass the torch to other generations. We need daily time in God's Word. We need worship music in our routines. We need to stop and pray before we eat and remember who's the provider. We need to attend church and be in regular Christian community with each other. We need Christ-focused holidays, right? Then let us stop and go, okay, that's what this is all about again. I remember. And we need to encourage those around us to embrace the God who loves us enough to send his own Son to conquer sin and death so that we could live. So, Back to the start. What torch are you passing? There's lots of things we make disciples about. But are we making disciples about the most important thing? And to whom are you passing your torch? If you were going to really stop and take these questions seriously, it would be wise to kind of walk through some of the things that Moses does with Joshua. Are you praying for direction? Lord, who are you putting in my life that I'm supposed to pass the torch of faith to? Am I equipping that person or those people? Am I honest with them about the fact that the Christian life's not a piece of cake? Like, it's hard. Like, I'm going to share real with them. Be careful not to make it about them. They're not the hero. They're not the savior. Keep the focus on God, right? Challenge them to be all in. When you see them holding back, point it out. Not in a I'm beating you up kind of way, but in a let's really go. Why are you holding back? And build routines in our own lives, in our homes, in our families that point to God. You never know how those things are going to make a difference later on down the road. You know, it's a silly thing, but that's why I give out suckers at church, or why Nick and I do that. Like, I want kids to grow up to remember I went to a church where they loved me and paid attention to me. That's why we give out suckers, right? Not because everyone needs another 4 calories every day, right? This isn't sustaining anyone. It's because we want people to know, we want these kids to grow up and go, I was loved. And when the poop hits the fan someday, and they've gone far from God, they go, I remember where I was loved. It's with God's people. And I'm going to find that again. That's what we want to see. Lord God, I pray that you would give us a vision for more. Lord, that we would not be content making disciples of silly things when we could be making disciples for you. That we would not pass along other torches and neglect the torch of faith. Lord, help us to live our faith out loud. To be ready, willing, and able to talk about what you've done in our lives. To invite others into that journey. Lord, that you'd allow us to shape and mold another generation of people who follow after you. Lord, thank you for the opportunities that we already have. Pray you would increase those opportunities. That you give us eyes to see and ears to hear. That we would not waste our lives, but we would invest it for your kingdom. God, thank you for inviting us into that process, for using us. Lord, help us to find our Joshua, or maybe a few, and really that you would use those relationships, that we could influence people for you. Lord, help us to pass that torch of faith. Help us to raise up leaders for the next generation. Thank you for those that you've used to invest in our lives. Now, there's a lot of us that would not be here without that 1 or 2 people that you sent to shape us for you. Lord, help us to be those kind of people as well. And we just give you praise for all you're going to do. In Jesus' name, amen. So over the next 3 weeks, we're actually going to talk about how to celebrate a Christian Christmas. Now, I say that carefully because I don't want it, this is not going to be a legalistic thing where you have to do this, this, and this, or you're not celebrating Christmas like a Christian, right? That's not the point of this. But to merely say, what is the heart of Christmas as a Christian? Where do we put our focus so that this is a Christian thing in our lives and not just a secular thing? What does that look like? So that's what we're going to dive into the next 3 weeks, and that will lead us to literally the day before Christmas, and we'll be wrapping that up. So hope you'll jump in and join us for those 3 messages.